The glass walls of the executive suite did nothing to muffle the storm brewing inside Zuri's mind, even if the skyline of the city looked peaceful from 40 floors up. She stood with her back to the mahogany conference table, her reflection in the window showing a woman who had curated every inch of her existence to project invincibility. At 30, Zuri was the CEO of one of the largest tech conglomerates in the hemisphere, a position she had fought for with the ferocity of a lioness, but today, her empire felt fragile, threatened not by market crashes or hostile takeovers, but by a clause in her grandfather's trust. The ultimatum had been delivered in a crisp, cream-colored envelope that now sat unopened but memorized on her desk. Marry within the month to secure the voting shares, or watch the board dissolve her leadership. It was archaic, insulting, and legally binding. She didn't need love. She needed a logistic solution. She needed a body in a suit who could smile on cue, sign a prenuptial agreement without blinking, and vanish into the background when the doors closed. Her assistant, Teo, cleared her throat from the doorway, breaking Zuri's stare. Teo was the only person allowed to see the cracks in the armor, mostly because she was the one holding the glue. She held a tablet with a list of vetted candidates from an elite, discreet agency that specialized in crisis management personnel, a polite term for high-end liars. Zuri turned, her face composed into a mask of boredom. She didn't want a husband. She wanted an employee. The men she had interviewed so far were too eager, too intimidated, or too obviously chasing the cloud of her surname. She needed someone who didn't care about her money because they had their own ghosts to chase. She needed a blank slate. Teo swiped to the final profile, a man with no digital footprint and a vague background in international security. The agency called him Ren. Zuri glanced at the photo. Sharp features, eyes that seemed to look through the camera lens, and an air of stillness that unnerved her. Send him in, Zuri commanded, smoothing the invisible wrinkles on her blazer. And have the legal team draft the termination clause. I want him gone the second the ink is dry on the marriage certificate. The man who walked into her office did not move like a hired actor. He moved like water flowing through a crack in a dam, silent, inevitable, and dangerous. Ren was taller than he appeared in the photo, with an elegance that clashed with the sterile corporate environment. He wore a simple black suit that fit a little too perfectly, suggesting he was used to wearing expensive clothes, or perhaps used to blending into shadows. He didn't fidget or look at the panoramic view of the city, which was the first test most candidates failed. Instead, his dark eyes locked onto Zuri's, holding her gaze with a calm intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. Zuri was used to men shrinking in her presence, but Ren looked at her as if he were assessing a threat level, or perhaps solving a puzzle. He didn't know that she was the puzzle he had been looking for, or at least the key to it. Ren, known in the underworld of Seoul as Minjun, the ruthlessly efficient head of the Semantic Syndicate, was not here for the money. He was here because a whisper in the wind had suggested that the woman he had loved and lost 5 years ago, a woman who had vanished without a trace, was hiding within the inner circle of this very city's elite. To find her, he needed access. He needed to be inside the fortress of high society, and Zuri was the gatekeeper. He watched the beautiful, steely woman behind the desk list her demands with the precision of a military commander. She spoke of appearances, of non-disclosure agreements, and of emotional distance. It was almost amusing. She thought she was the one in control. She thought she was hiring a prop. She had no idea she was inviting a wolf into her home, one who had spent the last decade tearing down men twice as powerful as her board of directors. Do you understand the terms? Zuri asked, her voice sharp, expecting hesitation. Ren leaned back in the leather chair, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Perfectly, he said, his voice deep and smooth, carrying a slight accent that made the single word sound like a promise. I play the part. I protect the asset. I leave when the job is done. The transformation process began the next morning, and it was an exercise in friction. Zuri was a micromanager by nature, and she treated Ren like a rebranding project. She dragged him to her personal tailor, critiquing fabrics and cuts with a critical eye, trying to mold him into the perfect accessory for her arm. But Ren was not a mannequin. When the tailor moved to measure his shoulders, Ren flinched, a micro-movement, a reflex of someone who didn't like being touched by strangers, before settling back into his calm persona. Zuri caught it, her eyes narrowing. Nervous? She teased, trying to reassert dominance. Just efficient, Ren countered, catching her gaze in the mirror. He allowed her to pick his ties, to dictate his backstory. A consultant from overseas, wealthy enough to be vague, boring enough to avoid questions, but he pushed back on the small things. He refused to wear the flashy watch she selected, choosing a sleek, understated vintage piece instead. He corrected her on the wine selection for their engagement dinner. It was these small acts of rebellion that irritated Zuri, yet fascinated her. He wasn't afraid of her. In fact, he seemed to find her stress amusing. As they sat in the back of her limousine, rehearsing their "How We Met" story, the air between them crackled with a strange energy. It wasn't quite attraction, but it was far from the cold indifference she had paid for. "You're too stiff," Ren said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If you hold my arm like you're carrying a briefcase, no one will believe we're in love. They'll think you're arresting me," Zuri bristled, pulling her hand away. "I don't do public displays of affection," Ren chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Then you're going to lose your company," he said simply. "People don't look at the ring, Zuri. They look at the eyes. They look for the gravitation. You have to look at me like I'm the only thing keeping you tethered to the earth." He turned in his seat, shifting his body toward her, and for a second, the playfulness vanished. He looked at her with such convincing, devastating longing that Zuri's breath hitched in her throat. It was a performance, she told herself. A masterclass in deception. But as the car turned toward the venue, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't entirely sure what was real and what was a lie. The engagement party was a Shark Tank disguised as a cocktail reception. The ballroom was filled with the city's power players, people who would smile to Zuri's face while sharpening knives to stick in her back. The air smelled of expensive perfume and betrayal. Zuri walked in with Ren on her arm, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She held her head high, the picture of confidence, but inside, she was waiting for the first blow. It came from Silas, a rival tech mogul who had been trying to acquire her company for years. He cornered them near the champagne tower, his smile oily and predatory. "Zuri," he drawled, looking Ren up and down with open disdain. "I didn't realize you were desperate enough to import a husband. What agency did you find him at?" "The clearance rack." The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Zuri opened her mouth to eviscerate him with a retort, but Ren moved first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a scene. He simply stepped into Silas's personal space, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that instantly shifted the dynamic. He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly from a distance but was clearly a pressure point held up close, judging by the way Silas's face drained of color. Ren leaned in, whispering something in a language Zuri didn't recognize, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. Whatever he said caused Silas to stumble back, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "Apologies," Ren said loudly enough for the nearby group to hear, switching back to English with a charming smile. "I think he just remembered an urgent appointment." He guided a stunned Zuri away, his hand firm and warm on the small of her back. "What did you say to him?" Zuri hissed, her pulse racing, partly from the adrenaline and partly from the heat radiating off him. "I just reminded him that manners are universal," Ren replied, grabbing 2 flutes of champagne and handing one to her. His hand wasn't shaking. He looked completely at home in the chaos. Zuri looked at him, really looked at him, and saw that the consultant she had hired was a fortress she hadn't anticipated. The drive back to Zuri's penthouse was silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the awkward quiet of strangers, but the heavy, charged silence of 2 people who had shared a foxhole. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, painting streaks of gold and red across the leather interior. Zuri felt the adrenaline crash, leaving her exhausted, her defenses lowered. She kicked off her heels the moment the elevator doors opened into her foyer, the marble floor cool against her feet. She expected Ren to retreat to the guest wing immediately, to clock out of his shift. Instead, he followed her into the living room, loosening his tie with a weary sigh. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city, his reflection ghosting over the glass. "You did well tonight," Zuri admitted, her voice softer than usual. It was a concession, a rare admission of need. "You saved me back there." Ren didn't turn around immediately. He was looking at the scattering of lights, thinking of a different woman, a different life. But the image of his lost love was feeling strangely static tonight, overlaid by the vibrant, terrifying reality of Zuri in that red dress, fighting for her legacy. He turned, his face unreadable. "It's part of the contract," he said, but the words lacked their usual bite. He walked over to the kitchen island where she was pouring water, stopping just a few feet away. The tension in the room spiked, a sudden awareness of proximity. He reached out, his fingers hovering near her face, as if to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a reflex of intimacy that shouldn't exist between them. Zuri froze, her breath catching, her eyes searching his for a sign of the game. But Rin pulled his hand back at the last second, clenching it into a fist at his side. The mask slipped back into place, but the crack had been seen. "Get some sleep, Zuri," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Tomorrow is going to be harder." He walked away, leaving her standing in the dark, wondering why the safest she had ever felt was with a man she was paying to lie to her. The days that followed the engagement party blurred the sharp edges of their arrangement, transforming the penthouse from a sterile negotiation zone into something dangerously resembling a home. Zuri had expected Ren to remain a shadow, a utility player who only appeared when the script required it, but he occupied space with an aggravatingly comfortable gravity. He didn't just exist, he lived. He reorganized her kitchen with the efficiency of a tactical strike, claiming that her chaotic spice rack was an insult to order. He replaced her burned coffee with precise, pour-over blends that tasted like smoke and velvet. One rainy Tuesday, Zuri came home early to find him sitting on the floor of the living room, surrounded by parts of her malfunctioning security server, rewiring the motherboard with a soldering iron. He wasn't wearing the suit. He was in a white t-shirt that clung to his frame, revealing scars on his arms that spoke of a history far more violent than corporate espionage. Zuri stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. "I have a tech team for that," she said, though her voice lacked its usual command. Ren didn't look up, his hands steady as a surgeon's. "Your tech team leaves back doors open," he murmured, the soldering iron hissing. "I'm closing them." He looked up then, his hair messy, his eyes unguarded. "I don't like things that leave you exposed." Zuri, the way he said her name, stripping it of its title and armor, made her knees weak. They ate takeout on the floor that night, the glass table forgotten. They talked about nothing and everything, about the way the rain hit the glass, about the silence of high altitudes. Ren told her a story about a friend in Seoul who lost everything chasing a ghost, a thinly veiled confession about his own futile search for his past love. Zuri listened, watching the way the city lights reflected in his dark eyes, and for the first time, she didn't want to know about the woman he was looking for. She just wanted him to stop looking. The deadline for the trust fund vote arrived with the weight of a guillotine. The weeks of public appearances, the stolen glances, the way Ren's hand had started to feel like the only anchor in a spinning world, it all culminated in a boardroom filled with geriatric men who viewed Zuri as a temporary placeholder. She stood at the head of the table, Ren at her side, her hand tightly clasped in his. He wasn't just a prop anymore. He was a battery, feeding her a calm, lethal confidence. When the questions about his background came, sneering, probing inquiries from her uncle, Ren answered with a blend of charm and menace that silenced the room. He spun a tale of international consulting that was so close to the truth of his criminal empire that it rang undeniably authentic. They won the vote. The gavel came down, securing Zuri's control for the next decade. The room erupted in polite applause, but Zuri couldn't hear it. She was looking at Ren, who offered her a small, private smile that felt like a secret language. But as the adrenaline faded, the old fear roared back. She had won. The contract was fulfilled. The necessity of him was gone, and that meant the only thing left was the terrifying reality of her feelings. If he stayed, he could break her. If he stayed, she would have to admit that the Iron CEO was just a lonely woman who liked the way he made coffee. Panic, cold and familiar, seized her chest. She needed to purge the vulnerability before it solidified. She needed to be the boss again. The drive back to the penthouse was suffocating. Ren seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, his earlier warmth replaced by a watchful silence. When they entered the apartment, Zuri marched straight to her desk, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble. She opened the drawer and pulled out the pre-prepared check, the final payment they had agreed upon. It was a staggering sum, enough to disappear anywhere in the world. She turned to him, her face composed into a mask of ice, though her hands were trembling slightly. "The funds have been transferred," she said, her voice brittle. "The lawyers will handle the annulment quietly next month. You can leave tonight." Ren looked at the check, then at her face. He didn't move to take it. The silence stretched, heavy and agonizing. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "The job is done, so the staff is dismissed?" Zuri lifted her chin, fighting the sting of tears. "It was a transaction, Ren. Don't confuse the performance with reality. You were excellent, but I don't need a bodyguard anymore." It was a lie so sharp it cut her tongue. Ren stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. He looked at the check, then laughed. A dark, humorless sound. "You think I did this for the money?" He took the check from her hand and tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. "I have more money buried in accounts you couldn't access with a warrant. I stayed because I thought you were brave enough to want something real." He turned his back on her, walking toward the guest suite to pack. "You're not the woman I thought you were, Zuri. You're just another empty room in a glass tower." The week after Ren left was a lesson in the physics of absence. The penthouse, once a sanctuary of silence, now felt like a mausoleum. Zuri went to work. She barked orders. She signed mergers. But the fire was gone. Teo watched her with open disapproval, placing a mug of office coffee on her desk with a thud. "It tastes like dirt," Zuri complained, pushing it away. "That's because you fired the barista who knew how to make it," Teo snapped, crossing her arms. "And don't look at me like that. I'm your assistant, not your sycophant. You won the company, Zuri. Congratulations. You're the queen of the castle. So, why do you look like you're waiting for an execution?" Zuri spun her chair around to face the window, looking at the gray skyline. "He was a distraction," she whispered, trying to convince herself. "He was a liar, Teo. His background didn't check out. He was dangerous," Teo sighed, softening. "The only dangerous thing about that man was how much he loved you. And how much you loved him." The truth hung in the air, undeniable. Zuri opened the bottom drawer of her desk, pulling out the vintage watch Ren had left behind, the one he refused to trade for the flashy Rolex. He had left it as a message. He wasn't coming back for it. He had cut the tie. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was safe. She was rich. She was powerful. And she was entirely, devastatingly alone. She grabbed her coat. "Cancel my meetings," Zuri said, rushing toward the door. "I have to find him." Finding a man who didn't want to be found was impossible for a CEO, but Zuri knew the one thread she hadn't pulled. She went to the agency, address on his original file, a dusty office in the warehouse district that turned out to be a front for a private gambling den. She walked in, her couture suit glowing like a beacon in the dim, smoke-filled room. Heads turned. Men with scars and tattoos stopped their conversations. Zuri didn't flinch. She marched to the bar, where a man with an eye patch was wiping a glass. "I'm looking for Min-jun," she said, using the name she had seen on his passport, the name of the ghost. The bartender paused, his one eye narrowing. "No one uses that name here unless they have a death wish, lady." Before he could signal the bouncers, a door in the back opened. Ren stepped out. He looked different, harder, darker. He was wearing a leather jacket, his hair slicked back, and the air around him crackled with authority. He was in his element, the boss of a world she didn't understand. He saw her, and for a second, the mask faltered. He said something in Korean, and the room instantly relaxed, the men backing down. He walked over to her, stopping a foot away. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice rough. This isn't a boardroom, Zuri. It's not safe. Zuri looked at him, seeing the danger, the history, the violence, and realizing none of it mattered. I don't care, she said, her voice shaking but loud. I don't care about the safety. I care that you left your watch, she held it out. And I care that I can't sleep because the apartment is too quiet. Ren looked at the watch, then at her. I'm not a consultant, Zuri. I'm not a nice man. I spent 5 years looking for a woman who died a long time ago, only to realize I was using her memory to avoid living. He stepped closer, the magnetic pull between them erasing the room. I stopped looking the day I met you, but you sent me away. I was scared, Zuri admitted, the tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. I treat everything like a contract because contracts can't hurt you. But I don't want a contract, Ren. I want the risk. The admission broke the last of the tension. Ren reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a tear. The touch was electric, familiar and possessive. No more prenups, he murmured, his eyes searching hers. No more exit clauses, Zuri laughed, a watery, broken sound of relief. No more exit clauses, she agreed. He kissed her then, a desperate, claiming thing that tasted of rain and redemption, right there in the middle of a criminal den with 20 gangsters watching. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Ren rested his forehead against hers. I still have to finish some business here, he whispered, glancing at the back room. The past has a few loose ends. Zuri grabbed his lapels, pulling him back. Let the lawyers handle it, she joked, though her eyes were serious. I have a company to run, and I need my partner. Ren smiled, the first genuine, unburdened smile she had ever seen on him. Okay, he said, interlacing his fingers with hers. Let's go home. They walked out into the night, the city skyline waiting for them, no longer a fortress to be defended, but a kingdom to be shared.